Imagine you're about to turn into this junction. Looks clear, right? Wrong. See there? A car's coming, and chances are you didn't even see it. If you pulled out, that could have been a violent T-bone crash, perhaps even fatal. But here's the scary part. This happens a lot. 80% of collisions at intersections happen because drivers don't see other cars coming, which is exactly why most modern vehicles now come equipped with these. They're called daytime running lights, or DRLs, and while they look simple, the impact they have on road safety is extraordinary. They've been shown to reduce certain types of crashes by up to nearly 40%, preventing hundreds of thousands of accidents every year. These lights are the lowest effort, most cost-effective safety device the car industry has ever created, which is why in countries like Canada, Sweden, and Finland, they have been mandatory for well over 30 years. And yet, despite their life-saving track record, to this day, DRLs still aren't legally required in the US. And I'm going to tell you exactly why in a minute. I'll also show you why this safety feature might actually increase your risk of experiencing a very different kind of crash. And I guarantee that by the end of this video, you'll never look at those little lights the same way again. Back in the 70s, car engineers began noticing a disturbing pattern. Drivers weren't seeing each other, and not in storms or fog, but in broad daylight. At dawn, dusk, or against a busy background, oncoming cars were disappearing. While attempting to address this problem, a study carried out here in the US in the late 60s revealed something unexpected. By just turning headlights on during the day, crashes dropped by 18%. And then, just a few years later, a similar study showed the same result, this time with a 7% reduction. And when you begin to scale those numbers across an entire country, we're talking about the potential to prevent hundreds of thousands of crashes every year. So the USA, home to more road fatalities than the next 9 countries combined, took this discovery and did absolutely nothing. Instead, the birthplace of DRLs was here in Scandinavia. In places like Sweden, winters are long, cold, and dark. And during those months, the sun barely rises. Even at midday, visibility can be dangerously low. That's why in 1977, Sweden introduced notice lights, legislation that required drivers to have their headlights on during the day. Soon, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway followed suit, and almost immediately the results from this simple change became obvious. In Sweden, certain crash types dropped by as much as 21%. Finland saw up to a 27% reduction in rural collisions, and in Denmark, left-turn crashes fell by 37%. The data was indisputable. In places that mandated DRLs, on average, daytime collisions dropped between 7 and 15%. Other countries took notice and began to adopt the practice. In 1990, Canada became the first non-European country to use DRLs, and soon, the EU made them mandatory on all new cars across the continent. And the early days of daytime running lights were bright. Actually, maybe a little too bright. In those first Scandinavian models, DRLs were just dimmed headlights. It was a simple fix, but one that caused some major problems. You see, headlights that looked fine at noon could feel like floodlights at dusk, and automakers were using high beams dipped at 50% power, which for some cars was still over 7,000 candela. That's 700 times brighter than your average household bulb. Or even worse, some manufacturers used turn signals as DRLs, which meant other drivers couldn't tell if the car was turning or just driving straight. Glaring and signal confusion were just the start. There were efficiency problems here too. Running full intensity low beams all day drew up to 200 watts if both the front and rear lights were on. And besides, headlight bulbs weren't designed to operate continuously. Many had lifespans of under 2,000 hours. All this ultimately meant more fuel use, more emissions, and more regular bulb replacements. But the answer to all these early problems seemed obvious: dedicated daytime lights. The EU would also introduce brightness standards, both of which would help reduce glare and unnecessary headlight use. And while these changes helped, they still weren't perfect. Halogen DRLs still required extra bulbs, which meant more parts to install, replace, and cram into the already crowded car front. But then in 2005, Audi changed the game. They unveiled this, the new Audi A8. And sure, at a glance, it looks like any other early 2000s Audi, but take a closer look, and you'd see something different. Those right there, they're LEDs, and this was the first time they'd been used on the front of a production car. They were bright, energy efficient, and practically immortal. With LEDs, Audi solved the energy and reliability issues that had plagued earlier DRL designs. LEDs used only a fraction of the power of halogen bulbs and contributed less than a 1% increase in fuel consumption. Not only that, but the compact nature of LEDs allowed for design flexibility. As the rest of the automotive industry adopted LEDs, DRLs became style statements. Signature shapes that wrapped around grills, swept under headlights, and gave each brand a unique, recognizable look. But as DRLs got smarter and sleeker, something strange started to happen. In Norway, traffic analysts began noticing a troubling trend. While front-to-front crashes were going down, rear-end collisions increased by 20%. And the reason for this was disturbingly simple. DRLs only illuminated the front of the car. The rear lights, along with full headlights, still relied on the driver to manually switch them on. But as newer cars rolled off the line with automatic DRLs and brightly lit dashboards, drivers started to forget that they still needed to activate their full lights at night or in poor weather. And this simple mistake was beginning to have a deadly impact.
Driving in the wrong lane and without headlights. Sitting on the interstate with no headlights on.
They're called phantom vehicles.
A vehicle with the headlights out.
The truck didn't have its headlights on.
And as collisions began to pile up, public complaints poured in, and eventually in September 2021, Canada took action. All new vehicles sold would need to meet stricter visibility standards. Automakers were given 3 ways to comply. Either the rear lights had to turn on automatically with the front DRLs, or the entire headlight system had to activate in low light conditions, or the dashboard would stay dark unless the driver manually turned on the lights. It was a simple but important fix, one that brought the technology back in line with its original purpose, being seen. Now, you'd think saving lives would be an easy sell, but that's not always the case, because not every country is Sweden. And when the engineers first tried to bring DRLs to the highways of the United States, it didn't exactly go smoothly. Despite countless international studies proving that DRLs could reduce daytime crashes, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration rejected a proposal to mandate them back in 1987. Even a major US government study in 2008 concluded that the benefits weren't statistically significant.
A Highway Traffic Safety Administration study found daytime running lights reduce head-on and front corner collisions, but there's no proof they save lives.
Critics argued that what worked in the long, gray winters of Finland was useless in the bright streets of California. One senator dismissed DRLs as a solution in search of a problem. And when General Motors began adding DRLs to their vehicles in the 90s, it didn't go unnoticed. For years, motorcyclists had used headlights to stand out in traffic. Now, with cars doing the same thing, bikers worried that they'd vanish into the noise. Although so far, data hasn't shown a clear spike in motorcycle accidents due to DRLs. But their concern was real, and plenty of car drivers didn't appreciate the new lights either. Thousands of complaints flooded into the Department of Transportation. Anti-DRL groups began to organize. They launched a campaign to ban them nationwide, claiming that they caused blinding glare, added no real safety value, and were only being pushed by automakers for profit. And yeah, to be fair, they weren't totally wrong on that last part. GM was already required to design its cars with DRLs for its Canadian customers, and making one system for both markets was certainly the cheaper option. Regardless, the benefits of these things are hard to ignore. No other safety device could deliver a 7 to 15% reduction in crashes for the price of turning on a single light bulb. In the end, NHTSA reached a compromise. DRLs would be allowed but not required. And that's why even today you can still buy a new car in the US without them, although more than 60% of new vehicles now come with DRLs by default. But around the world, they've quickly become the norm. By 2020, more than 40 countries had made DRLs mandatory, and most major automakers now design their cars to meet EU lighting standards. What started as a simple idea, just keeping your lights on during the day, evolved into one of the most transformative safety innovations in automotive history. So the next time you see a car approaching with its LEDs glowing in broad daylight, take a moment to appreciate what that light is doing. It's not just part of the design, it's there to be seen and keep you safe. And if you thought that was clever, wait until you hear what airlines have been doing with seat design. Click here to watch our last video on the hidden engineering of plane seats. It's a surprising story about airline safety, crash data, and why your seat choice might matter a lot more than you think.